From the News Channel 5 Network, this is MorningLine with Nick Beres.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on MorningLine. I'm Nick Beres on this Thursday. A good show on tap. You know, yesterday we had Vice Mayor Jim Schulman on. We were talking about the Metro budget and a lot of money set aside for different things. One segment that we talked briefly about, not one of the larger chunks of money, you know, in the scheme of things, but a lot of money, I think, you know, for this purpose is the Mental Health Coop got about $800,000 to continue some of the work they're doing in the direction of assisting law enforcement when they're responding to calls. And many of them, gosh, they'd tell you the vast majority of calls they respond to sometimes are either someone who's on drugs or someone who's having a mental issue of some point. And law enforcement, I think, does a terrific job under those circumstances trying to respond. But as we know, you know, that's not their specialty. Their specialty is law enforcement. And we've had some recent cases back in March and May. And we're going to show some of the video today in the show and talk about how things maybe will evolve and how we treat those instances where there was a woman, remember, they responded out who was kind of out of her head with a sickle or an axe. And the officers ultimately, one of them had to shoot her. They shot her. She survived to this day. She's okay, but she suffered severe injuries, but it was because she was out of her head. And then in, I think it was in May, there was an incident where we covered, they responded to a homeless encampment and an individual there with a weapon. His mom called to say she was fearing him. They had to respond, and it just escalated after hours of negotiating to the point where he had to be shot and killed. Now I say had to because those were the circumstances at the moment, but could things be different if these officers were accompanied by a mental health expert in terms of just trying to talk and de-escalate these situations? That, I think, is the future of policing on a lot of fronts, and it's happening here in Nashville. We're going to talk this morning with someone working with law enforcement with the Mental Health Co-op. Amanda Bracht's with us this morning. Did I kind of lay that out all right?
Absolutely, yes.
I think it's the future in a lot of ways. I'm going to have you explain the Mental Health Co-op's effort with law enforcement here in Metro. You're the Senior VP of Clinical Services, but would you agree that the vast majority of calls that law enforcement responds to, serious calls, it's either something involving drugs, or maybe someone having a mental issue of some point? Now, I know there's bank robbery still, and there's speeding tickets and crashes and things like that. But, I mean, that's a large chunk of what they respond to.
Absolutely. They respond to a lot of calls about someone in distress. I mean, that's why people call 911.
Right.
They are in distress, and it could be that they are having a mental health issue, they are contemplating suicide, or they're calling for their loved one who has gotten agitated off medication if they have a serious mental illness. Substance abuse is definitely on the rise. We've seen numbers skyrocket, particularly during the pandemic, which is a complicated factor, obviously. And people dealing with trauma. When somebody has a history of severe trauma and let's say they're a victim of a crime, that can trigger them, and they may act more out of control to the point that law enforcement is having to not only address the crime that occurred, but also try to de-escalate that person who has had a severe trauma reaction.
Now, I've heard Don Aaron on some of these instances afterwards talk about, and he's the Metro Police PIO, and the police chief has said as much too. They try to get some training with their officers on this, and they do. And these officers in these cases do the best they can. Maybe talk a bit about the role and what we're talking about, the crisis intervention team, and how we're trying to evolve and maybe meld what these officers are trained for, which is first and foremost law enforcement, not mental health treatment, and what you guys do.
Sure. Well, let me first say, Metro officers have received mental health training for years as part of the academy. So they go through a very intensive academy, and in addition to being trained in tactical stuff that officers need, they get basic mental health training, and it's outside experts coming in, people from our office who do a lot of that. But that doesn't prepare you for what it's really like, and it certainly doesn't prepare them to be a mental health clinician when you're dealing with very serious crisis situations. So they really invested a lot of time in making sure all officers have an awareness and know when to access resources. But again, they're not clinicians.
Sure.
Crisis intervention, a team, is not a new concept. It's actually something that started over 20 years ago in Memphis after a tragedy. Individual with mental illness was shot and killed, and their city came together and said, we've got to do better in regards to how we respond. And so they developed this this program that is now an international model where you train officers who volunteer, they want to be trained, receive extra training than what the frontline officer gets. You train them for 40 hours. The training involves scenarios where you actually do intensive role plays, and clinicians like myself will critique and say, okay, you might want to do this, you might want to do that. So they get that training, and then the traditional model is those special officers try to, when a call comes into dispatch, go to those that dispatch identified as having a mental health component. And then they assess the situation and then try to connect that person to help. Metro, when we got in discussions with Metro PD, we decided to take it a step further and say we need to do CIT, but we also need to do a co-response model. And this was after we looked at models across the country. And Denver has a model that stood out to us. They started with CIT, and then they took it to this co-response model where mental health clinicians actually ride with officers and they respond together. So call comes through dispatch. Dispatch is trained to identify that there's a mental health component, and those co-response teams go to that call. So you have the clinician working side by side with the officer from the very onset of the situation.
So they go together. Does the clinician get, as the officers you said, get some CIT training? Do the clinicians, before they go on a ride along with these officers to potentially dangerous situations, get some training on the other side?
Absolutely. We just wrapped up the first training as we're getting ready to pilot this project, and our counselors, we have 6 volunteer counselors who are all master's level mental health clinicians, received several days of training on basic safety, how, if a situation happens where they need to get on the radio, how to do that, how to call for help if that's needed, and if the officer is not able to do so.
And this is the pilot. When will it begin? How's it shaping up with Metro?
We are, our date right now is June 28th to launch.
June 28th, and what that means is that they will be on call, and if there is a situation that comes up that meets the criteria that you kind of laid out, the mental health aspect, then they'll get the call, their phone will ring, and they'll say, oh, come on down to Metro, we're heading out on an emergency call?
Well, actually, it's a little bit different than that. So we're piloting in 2 precincts in town. We looked at data and decided that North Precinct and Hermitage Precinct are our 2 targets. And we looked at that based on volume of current mental health calls and just volume of calls in general. And the clinician actually at the start of the shift for the officer at roll call, when officers start their shift, the clinician will be paired with the officer who's trained that day and will be riding with them, not only on the mental health calls, but let's
just
say,
on everything, that they'll be there then.
Absolutely.
This is a full-time thing kind of in a way. So that they may or may not get a call that deals with it. And there's all different levels. We're going to show, again, in our next segment when we come back, we're going to go into these 2 where the video was released. And they're the 2, in my opinion, that are the most extreme type of thing you'll encounter.
Yes.
But there are lesser ones as well. Would they go with an officer, for instance, not that this is lesser, but maybe not the same as these 2 which are on video, like a domestic?
Yes.
Okay, they go. Those are very emotional. Some of those are the most dangerous calls. There's a husband and wife maybe, and there maybe is some physical contact. It's getting out of hand, very emotional. They'd go with on that.
They would go with that. They would go on, let's say there's an overdose and EMS is there, but also officers are called because there's a situation that involves, drugs or anything like that. They will go on those. If there's been a burglary and a victim is traumatized, they'll go on those as well. Their primary response will be, or their primary responsibility will be to go on those calls that have that mental health component. But that officer is still going to be available to go on any call for service in that area, and that clinician's just going to happen to be with them.
Okay. Will the clinician be armed?
No. The clinician will not be armed.
Will they be wearing bulletproof vests?
Yes, they will.
They will. And do you think this is a pilot? So you'll see how this goes. For instance, if they are traveling with an officer all day and you just see to some degree that they're not just going on a lot of these mental health calls. They respond with the officer at a fender bender or to a bank robbery or something like that. Then you guys will, I guess, modify it depending on how this goes. But it sounds like a good idea on how to start by isolating these 2 where there's plenty. Any idea just off the top of your head on average how many potential mental health calls they get, say, from the Hermitage or North precincts? I mean, is it a few a day, a dozen a day, maybe half dozen a week?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I believe it's definitely daily that there's calls.
Daily there are calls, so they'll try to match. When those calls come in and they know, well, there's these 2 that are together, we're going to send them to this because we know that's the case.
Correct.
Interesting. I think it's great. It's just great. All right, so that's going to start June 28th. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we have phone calls, 737-7587. If you'd like, tune in on that, and we'll take your calls. But when we come back, too, I think What do you say, Amanda? When we come back, we'll put up the video from March. This is this woman, Melissa Wooden, who is kind of out of her head. You're familiar with both of these, I imagine.
Yes.
But we'll play some of the video that was released by Metro and show how these officers were engaging. And then we can talk about how in similar situations, if that officer is with a clinician, how things might be a bit different one way or the other. How about that?
Okay.
Let's take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.